We're pregnant. Maybe vasectomies sometimes fail. My wife cheered 6 weeks after I returned from a work trip, even though she knew I'd been sterilized. Then she tried to manipulate me and avoid the DNA test. When my older brother accidentally got his girlfriend pregnant in his teens, my parents decided I couldn't make the same mistake. So on my 16th birthday, instead of taking me for pizza and cake, my parents took me to a clinic to have a vasectomy. I didn't understand what vasectomy meant until years later in the worst possible way. I was dating Sophia at the time, but after the third date, I knew I wanted to marry her and start a family. When I told my parents, they laughed. She told you she wanted 3 children together. Son, you can't give her any children. We made sure of that with your vasectomy. Dad explained it bluntly. The truth felt like a punch in the stomach. I felt betrayed. I stopped talking to my parents that week, but I couldn't tell Sophia. Not yet. I was too terrified and ashamed. So I kept dating her. We got engaged, then we got married. All while carrying this secret. But I promised myself I would tell her the truth someday when I was ready. But 8 months after the marriage, she brought up the topic of starting a family. I told her gently, let's wait a few years and get settled, hoping it would buy me more time to fix the problem. She seemed disappointed, but she always agreed to wait. And so, for the last 6 months, I had been going from doctor to doctor in secret, discussing reversal surgeries, being rejected because the success rate of the reversal is almost impossible, but I kept my hope. Then, by some miracle, 2 weeks ago a surgeon replied to my email saying he was willing to try a new procedure with me. I was excited. The only thing I needed to do now was buy a little more time before telling her everything. That's when I found something strange. I found her birth control pills in the trash, still half full, along with ovulation tests that clearly showed she was trying to get pregnant while telling me directly to my face that she was willing to wait. I mean, the irony was quite disgusting. Her best friend even started making jokes during our outing about a surprise baby and how accidents are still blessings and that we could never be too sure. I realized that Sophia had been trying to trap me to finally have the baby she wanted while I was secretly sterile. But it didn't matter because after the surgery, I could give her what she wanted. What I didn't realize was that she would make it happen on her own. I had to leave town for a work convention for 4 days. When I returned, Sophia seemed different, more alive, happy, and hopeful. When I asked her what had changed, she mentioned that her coworker, Alejandro, had been helping her while I was away, keeping her company. I felt relieved. Maybe all she needed was some space and a friend to distract her until my surgery. But that same night, I found Sophia sobbing on the couch. I sat next to her, worried that something bad had happened, when suddenly she held up 3 positive pregnancy tests with trembling hands. We're pregnant, she celebrated, wrapping her arms around my neck while continuing to cry in my ear. I know it's scary, but we can do it. We'll be amazing parents together. I know, she whispered through her sobs. I stood there stunned and dizzy. This was impossible. Before I could process anything, she was on the phone calling her mother, her sister, and her best friend. She spent the rest of the day looking at baby supplies on Amazon, showing me videos on her phone to help us prepare for parenthood. And she even ordered me a World's Greatest Dad shirt to cheer me up. But I couldn't feel happy because I knew I wasn't the father, but I couldn't tell her how I knew. When she was busy, I opened her tracking app and saw that she had been pregnant for 6 weeks according to the dates, exactly the same time I had been out of town for the work convention. The same week she kept mentioning her coworker, Alejandro, who was apparently at the house helping her with an important project. I knew the truth, but I couldn't face it until I got home 2 days later to find her sitting in the kitchen with a grim expression, holding a piece of mail. My vasectomy reversal surgery confirmation letter. She looked at me and asked quietly, "How long have you had a vasectomy?" I sat next to her with the same grim expression. Since I was 16, I told her, explaining how cruel my parents were, how I had no choice. She looked at the letter again, then at the positive pregnancy test, proudly displayed on the counter. Neither of us saying anything, but we both knew. And now there was exactly one thing left to do. We sat there in the kitchen without saying anything for what felt like hours, but it was probably only 20 minutes. The surgery letter was on the table between us, with my name printed on top. The pregnancy test was still on the counter where she had left it that morning. 3 pink lines that proved something impossible had happened. I kept looking at the letter, then the test, then back at the letter. She did the same. Neither of us moved. Neither of us tried to explain or make excuses. We both knew what this meant. The kitchen clock ticked loud enough that I could count every second passing. I saw her hands tremble as she picked up the letter and read it again, as if maybe the words would change if she looked one more time. They didn't change. I finally forced myself to speak because the silence was making everything worse. I told her we needed to do a paternity test. My voice came out firmer than I expected, almost calm. She looked at me with tears running down her face and nodded slowly. She didn't argue. She didn't try to tell me that it was somehow still mine. She didn't bring up miracles or medical mysteries. She just nodded and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. That night, I grabbed my pillow and a blanket and went to the guest room. It was the first time in our entire marriage that we slept in different rooms. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to organize my thoughts into something that made sense. I started making lists in my head. Things I knew for sure versus things I was just guessing. I knew I had a vasectomy when I was 16. I knew it was permanent. I knew I had been away for 4 days on a work matter. I knew she was 6 weeks pregnant according to what the app said. I knew the timing matched exactly with when I was out of town. Those were facts. Everything else was just me, trying to fill in the blanks. I kept separating what was real from what I had been telling myself to feel better. The fantasy version, where somehow everything worked out. The real version, where my wife was having another man's baby. I didn't sleep much. The next morning I found her in the kitchen making coffee. She had her phone out and started showing me articles before I even sat down. She talked about how vasectomies sometimes fail. She showed me stories about men who got their partners pregnant years after the surgery. She read me statistics about spontaneous reversals. I listened and drank my coffee and didn't interrupt. When she finally stopped talking, I told her we were still going to do the paternity test. She looked at me for a long moment and then put her phone down. She didn't take it out again after that. Later that same morning, she asked me why I never told her about the vasectomy before we got married. So I explained everything. I told her how my older brother got his girlfriend pregnant when he was a teenager. I told her how my parents decided I couldn't make the same mistake. I told her how they took me to have the surgery on my 16th birthday, instead of taking me for pizza like normal parents. I explained that I didn't even know what the word vasectomy meant until years later when I wanted to start a family with her. She seemed shocked. She asked me over and over why I kept it a secret. I admitted I was too ashamed. I was afraid she would leave me if she knew I couldn't give her children. I was ashamed of what my parents did to me. I kept thinking I would find a way to fix it before I had to tell her the truth. She was quiet for a minute and then suggested that maybe the surgery I had scheduled somehow worked early. Maybe my body knew I wanted children so badly that it healed itself ahead of time. Maybe the doctor was wrong about how permanent it was. I looked at her face as she spoke and saw how much she wanted this to be true. It hurt to look at her with her desperate hope. I told her gently that medical things don't work like that. Bodies don't heal themselves just because we want them to. We needed to face what was really happening instead of making up stories that made us feel better. I spent the whole afternoon on my computer researching paternity tests. I learned about different types and which ones hold up in court. I read about chain of custody tests, where they document everything officially so no one can tamper with the results. I found a clinic on the other side of town that does the legal kind and called to make an appointment. They had an opening next Tuesday. I wrote down the date, time, and address. When I went downstairs, I told her when we were going. She just nodded. That evening I sat in the guest room and made a promise to myself. I was done with hiding things about my body and my past. I was done with protecting other people's feelings when it meant lying about my own truth. Whatever the outcome with this marriage, whatever happened next, I was not going to live in shame anymore. Not about the vasectomy, not about what my parents did, not about any of it. I was going to be honest even when it was hard. The next day, I called Dr. Luis Mendoza, the surgeon who did my original vasectomy and who was supposed to do my reversal. I explained what happened with my wife's pregnancy. I told him I needed proof of my medical history. He said he would put all my records together and write a letter confirming my status. He told me he was sorry for what I was going through. Hearing him say that made everything feel more real somehow, as if it wasn't just happening in my head anymore. It was real enough for other people to see. I also spent hours that night reading everything I could find about what happens when someone is not the biological father. I looked up legal rights and financial responsibility. I read about birth certificates and how names are added. I learned about custody and child support. I read forums where other men talked about finding out their children weren't theirs. The information kept piling up until my brain felt too full, but I forced myself to keep reading. I needed to understand every possible thing that could happen. I needed to know my options before we went for that test, even though I already knew what the results would say. The next few days turned into a strange routine where Sophia and I existed in the same space without really being together. I moved my things into the guest room down the hall. She kept the master bedroom. We would pass each other in the kitchen during breakfast and sometimes in the hallway when we were both coming or going. The silence between us felt thick and uncomfortable. Neither of us knew what to say anymore. I realized we had been living like strangers for longer than just these last few days. Maybe we had been strangers all along, and I just didn't want to see it. She tried to start conversations a few times, but I couldn't do it. Every time I looked at her, I thought about the baby that wasn't mine. One morning, she came downstairs with her phone and sat at the kitchen table across from me. She started scrolling through baby name websites and showing me options. She would hold the phone out to me with a hopeful smile and ask what I thought about certain names. I felt my stomach churn. I got up from the table and left the room without a word. She called after me, but I went upstairs and closed the guest room door. I couldn't sit there and plan for a child that belonged to someone else. The gap between her hopeful planning and my grief felt impossible to cross. She wanted to pretend everything was normal. I couldn't pretend anymore. Later that day, I opened my laptop and created a new document. I titled it Timeline and started writing down every date I could remember from the last 2 months. I wrote when I left for the work convention. I noted the exact dates I was away. I wrote when I returned home. I added the date when she told me about the pregnancy. I calculated backward from her tracking app to figure out when she would have gotten pregnant. The dates matched my trip exactly. Seeing it all written out in black and white made the pattern clear and undeniable. I saved the document in a folder labeled Legal. I called the clinic again the next morning to confirm our appointment for the chain of custody paternity test. The scheduler answered and verified our information. She walked me through the whole process step by step. She told me we would both need to bring government IDs. She said they would take our pictures for documentation. She explained they would collect samples with witnesses present to maintain the chain of custody. She told me the results would take 7 to 10 business days after the test. I wrote down every detail she gave me in a notebook. Having something concrete to hold on to helped when everything else felt uncertain and messy. I needed facts and procedures. I needed things I could control. The next step was to figure out my legal rights. I searched online for family law attorneys in the area and found Pablo Ruiz. His website said he specialized in paternity and divorce cases. I called his office and scheduled a consultation for that week. When I met with Pablo in his office, he asked me to explain the whole situation from the beginning. I told him about the vasectomy when I was 16. I explained about my wife's pregnancy. I showed him my timeline document. He listened carefully and took notes. He told me that if I was not the biological father, I had no legal obligation to the child. He explained that being married did not automatically make me responsible if the paternity test proved otherwise, but then he asked me what I wanted for my marriage and my future. That question hit harder than I expected. I didn't have a clear answer yet. Pablo said he could help me with whatever I decided. He also suggested I get official documentation of my vasectomy history to support my case. He gave me Dr. Luis Mendoza's contact information and said Dr. Luis could provide the medical records I needed. I called Dr. Luis's office that afternoon and explained what was happening. Dr. Luis remembered me from our previous consultations about the reversal surgery. He said he would put together all my medical records from the original vasectomy. He offered to write a letter confirming I had been sterile since age 16. When I went to pick up the documents a few days later, Dr. Luis handed me a thick envelope. Inside were detailed records from when I was 16. There was also a letter on official letterhead stating my medical history and current status. Reading through the paperwork validated everything I had been saying, but it also made me angry all over again at my parents. They had done this to me without my real consent. They had taken away my choice. That afternoon, I brought up the topic of couples counseling with Sophia. Part of me thought we needed professional help to get through this. Part of me wanted a witness to whatever truth finally came out. She agreed immediately. She seemed relieved that I was willing to try to work on things. I wasn't sure yet if that's what I was really doing. I just knew we couldn't keep living like this without some kind of structure or guidance. I found Elena Vargas through my insurance provider's website. She specialized in marriage counseling and crisis intervention. I booked our first session for the following week. When we arrived at Elena's office, she had us sit on a couch across from her chair. She asked each of us to explain why we were there. I went first and laid out the basic facts. Vasectomy at 16, wife's pregnancy, timeline not adding up, need for paternity test. Sophia started crying before I even finished talking. Then, Elena asked Sophia to share her perspective. That's when Sophia admitted she had stopped taking her birth control 6 months ago without telling me. She said she thought if it just happened naturally, I wouldn't be as upset about having a baby. She said she was tired of waiting. Hearing her say it out loud in front of a therapist made something break inside me. Any trust one had been holding on to completely shattered. At that moment, Elena didn't react with shock or judgment. She just nodded and took notes. Then she asked us what we needed to move forward. I said we needed the paternity test done properly, with legal documentation. Elena helped us agree on the prenatal chain of custody test right there in her office. Having a neutral third party make it official somehow made it more real. Sophia agreed to all the terms without arguing. I think she was finally accepting that we needed real answers instead of hopeful stories. Before we left that first session, Elena helped us set some rules for living together while we waited for the results. Separate bedrooms, which we had already started, a shared kitchen schedule so we didn't overlap, no baby talk around me. It felt cold and businesslike, but it was the only way it could work. We both agreed to the terms. We scheduled our next session for 2 weeks later. On the drive home, neither of us spoke. When we got to the house, Sophia went straight to the master bedroom and I went to the guest room. I heard her door close. I closed mine too. The house felt emptier than it ever had before. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in the guest bed staring at the ceiling for hours, before finally giving up and turning on the lamp. I pulled out my laptop and started gathering every document I had about my vasectomy. I created a folder on my desktop and named it Documentation. I copied the medical records Dr. Louise had given me. I added the surgery confirmation letter Sophia had found in the mail. I typed up a timeline with dates and events, trying to organize everything in one place. When I was 16 and had the vasectomy, when I started dating Sophia, when we got married, when she stopped taking birth control without telling me, when I left for the convention, when she told me about the pregnancy. Seeing it all laid out in black and white made me feel less crazy. I had facts. I had proof. I had evidence that what I knew was true was really true. I saved everything and backed it up in 3 different places. Then, finally, I fell asleep around 4 a.m. with my laptop still open on the bed. The next afternoon, Sophia knocked on the guest room door. I opened it, and she was holding her phone, looking hopeful and a little desperate. She showed me article after article about vasectomy failures, stories about men who got their partners pregnant years after the procedure, cases of spontaneous reversal where the tubes somehow reconnected on their own. She scrolled through medical forums and Reddit threads, pointing out comments from people claiming it happened to them. Her voice got higher and faster as she talked, like she was trying to convince both of us at the same time. I listened without interrupting. When she was finished, I told her I appreciated that she wanted to believe in a miracle. I said I understood why she was looking for hope, but then I told her we were going to trust the medical test, not internet stories from strangers. We were going to get the real answer from real doctors with proper procedures. She looked at me for a long moment and then nodded slowly. She stopped showing me articles after that. A few days later, I realized I needed the original vasectomy records from when I was 16. Dr. Luis had given me copies from his files, but I wanted the complete documentation. I needed everything in one place. I called my dad and asked if he still had the paperwork from that clinic visit. The conversation was tense and awkward. He asked why I needed it, and I told him I was gathering my medical history. He didn't ask follow-up questions. Neither of us mentioned what they had really done to me or why. Neither of us talked about the fact that they took away my choice when I was just a kid. He said he would look through his files and send me copies. His voice sounded strained and defensive, but he agreed. We hung up after less than 5 minutes. That weekend, I went to the grocery store to pick up some basics, since I had been avoiding the kitchen when Sophia was around. I was in the cereal aisle when I saw Laura pushing a cart toward me. She was Sophia's best friend, the one who had made all those jokes about surprise babies and happy accidents. When she saw me, her whole face changed. She looked down at her cart and tried to turn around, but I had already seen her. I kept walking toward her because I wasn't going to make it easy for her. When we got close, She muttered a quick hi and didn't look at me directly. Her eyes darted to the shelves, to the floor, to anywhere but my face. I said, "Hi," back and kept my voice normal. We stood there for a few awkward seconds, and then she made some excuse about forgetting something and hurried away. I realized Sophia must have told her everything. Laura knew about the vasectomy and the pregnancy and the timeline that didn't add up. She felt guilty for her role in encouraging Sophia to trap me with a baby. Seeing her practically run away from me made the whole situation feel even more real. The following Monday, I called the clinic again to schedule the actual chain of custody test. The scheduler walked me through the process again, and we picked a date for the following week. She explained they would need both of us to be there for the intake and sample collection. She said the results would take 7 to 10 business days after that. I wrote down all the information and thanked her. After I hung up, I sat with my phone in my hand, feeling anxious and relieved at the same time. The appointment felt too soon and not soon enough. Part of me wanted to get it over with and have concrete proof. Part of me wanted to delay it forever and stay in this weird space where I knew the truth but didn't have official confirmation yet. I knew that once we had those results, everything would change in ways I couldn't take back. That evening, Sophia found me in the living room and suggested maybe we could use a cheaper at-home paternity test instead of going to the clinic. She tried to make it sound practical, like she was concerned about the cost. She said those mail-in kits were just as accurate and much more affordable. I looked at her and said no immediately. I told her we were doing the legal test with proper chain of custody procedures. I explained that I needed documentation that would hold up in court if it came to that. Her face fell, and she nodded without arguing. I could see in her eyes that she understood what I was really saying. I didn't trust her anymore. I needed everything official and verified because I couldn't take her word for anything. She left the room without another word. The next day, I called a friend from work and asked if I could stay at his place for a few days. He said yes right away, without asking too many questions. I started packing a bag in the guest room, folding clothes, gathering toiletries. It felt like I was practicing for something bigger. Every item I put in the bag felt significant, like I was deciding which parts of my life I wanted to take with me and what I was ready to leave behind. I wasn't sure if I would be back after a few days or if this was the start of something permanent. I zipped up the bag and put it by the door. When our second counseling session came the following week, Elena asked me to talk about the vasectomy and how it had affected me. I started explaining the shame I had carried for years about my body. I talked about feeling broken and less than other men. I described the fear and embarrassment that had kept me from telling Sophia the truth. Elena listened carefully and then helped me name what my parents had actually done. She used words like violated my consent and taken away my bodily autonomy. She explained that what happened to me at 16 was a form of abuse, even if my parents thought they were protecting me. Saying it all out loud in front of Sophia made me realize how deep that wound really was. I had been carrying this damage for over a decade, and it had shaped every relationship choice I had made. Then, Elena turned to address what Sophia had done. She said directly that stopping birth control without my knowledge was also a violation of consent. She explained that reproductive decisions have to be mutual, and that trying to get pregnant without telling me was a betrayal of trust. Hearing a professional name it that way made me feel vindicated. Someone else could see what had been done to me, but I also felt heartbroken because my wife, the person I had chosen to build a life with, had done this to me. Near the end of the session, I turned to Sophia and asked her directly about the timeline with the coworker during my trip. I kept my voice calm and factual. I told her I needed to understand what happened and when. I explained that I wasn't trying to punish her, but I deserved to know the truth about my own life. She looked at me with tears starting to form, but I didn't look away. She wiped her eyes and started to speak, but her words came out choppy and uncertain. She said she couldn't remember all the details because she had been so stressed with me being away and feeling lonely in the house. She mentioned the coworker's name was actually Alejandro with AJ, not Alejandro, and that they had hung out a few times during that week. When I pushed for specifics about what days and what they did, she got defensive and said she wasn't on trial. She told me she was trying to be honest, but I was making it impossible by interrogating her like she was a criminal. I felt my frustration growing, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I realized that pushing her now would only make her shut down more. I decided to let it go and wait for the paternity test to force the real truth out. Elena noted the attention and suggested we take a break from that topic for now. The session ended soon after, and we drove home in separate cars. 3 days later, we parked in the medical clinic's lot for the chain of custody paternity test. The building looked simple and professional, with gray siding and tinted windows. We walked in together but stood apart in the waiting area. A woman at the front desk handed us clipboards with intake forms. I filled out my personal information while Sophia did the same at the other end of the waiting room. When they called us back, a technician in blue scrubs checked both of our photo IDs against the forms. She took our pictures with a digital camera and had us sign multiple consent documents. She explained that the entire process would be witnessed and documented for legal purposes. She led us into a small exam room and swabbed the inside of my cheek with a long cotton stick. Then she did the same to Sophia. She labeled each sample container with our names and ID numbers while we watched. She had us initial the labels to confirm they were correct. The whole thing felt cold and official, like we were evidence in a crime instead of a married couple. I felt numb watching her seal the samples in plastic bags and fill out chain of custody paperwork. She told us the results would take 7 to 10 business days, and they would call with the information. We walked out of the clinic and back to our separate cars without saying a word to each other. The next afternoon, I sat in Pablo Ruiz's office going over what would happen once we had the test results. His office had dark wood furniture and law books lining the walls. He pulled out a folder and walked me through the different possible outcomes, even though we both knew what the results would show. He explained that if I was not the biological father, I had no legal obligation to the child. He talked about separation agreements and how we would divide property and finances. He said that in our state, a child born during marriage is automatically presumed to be the husband's unless we take legal action. He explained that we would need to file paperwork to remove my name from the birth certificate and establish that I have no parental rights or responsibilities. He mentioned that Sophia would need to identify the biological father so that person could be listed instead. He asked if I wanted to pursue a divorce immediately or start with a legal separation. I told him I needed to see the test results first before I made that choice, even though I already knew the answer. He nodded and said that was reasonable. He gave me homework to think about what I wanted in terms of dividing assets and whether I wanted to keep the house or sell it. His direct approach helped me feel less overwhelmed by all the legal details. 2 days later, my phone rang with my dad's number. I almost didn't answer, but I picked up on the 4th ring. He immediately asked why I was digging up the past and requesting old medical records. His voice had that defensive edge that made my shoulders tense up. I told him calmly that I needed the documentation for legal reasons. He wanted to know what kind of legal reasons, and I said I wasn't ready to explain everything yet. My mom got on the line and asked if we were being sued or if something was wrong. I repeated that I just needed copies of the vasectomy paperwork from when I was 16. Dad said they would have to dig through old files, and it might take time. I could hear the annoyance in his voice, as if I were being unreasonable for asking. Mom said they would look for the records, but she didn't understand why this was coming up now after all these years. I thanked them and ended the call before they could ask more. Their tone made it clear they thought I was making a big deal out of nothing. 4 days after that conversation, my mom called my cell phone in the afternoon. I was sitting on my friend's couch when I saw her name pop up. She sounded different, quieter this time, and less defensive. She said she needed to talk to me without Dad around. She admitted that she had always felt guilty about the vasectomy decision. She told me she had wanted to wait until I was older, but Dad had been so worried after what happened with my brother. She said she went along with it because she didn't want to fight with him, but she had regretted it for years. She told me she found some of the medical records in an old file cabinet and was mailing them to me. She said there was a note included where she tried to explain herself better. Her voice broke when she said she wished they had handled things differently. I didn't know what to say, so I just thanked her for sending the papers. After we hung up, I felt this strange mix of anger and empathy. Part of me wanted to stay mad at her, but another part felt sad that she had been carrying guilt for so long. The envelope from my mom arrived 2 days later. I opened it at my friend's kitchen table and pulled out a stack of photocopied medical forms. The paperwork was from the clinic where they took me on my 16th birthday. I read through the consent forms my parents had signed. There were multiple paragraphs explaining that a vasectomy was considered a permanent form of birth control. The language talked about irreversibility and how reversal success rates were very low. I saw my dad's signature on the bottom and my mom's next to it. Looking at those forms made me think about that 16-year-old version of myself who didn't understand what was happening. I remembered sitting in that clinic waiting room thinking I was just going for a regular checkup. I felt grief for that kid who trusted his parents and didn't know they were taking away his choice to have children someday. I sat there for a long time, just looking at the papers and feeling the weight of what they had done to me. In our third counseling session the following week, Elena started by asking how we were both coping with everything. The session felt heavier than the previous ones. She said she wanted to shift our focus to accountability and what each of us needed to move forward. She asked Sophia to talk about her choices and their impact on me. Sophia started crying almost immediately, but Elena gently pushed her to stay in the conversation. She asked me to talk about what the betrayal felt like and what I needed from Sophia now. The conversation got harder and more honest than it had been before. I could feel both of us finally facing what we had done to each other instead of avoiding it. Elena didn't let either of us hide behind excuses or deflect blame. She kept bringing us back to the core issues of trust, consent, and honesty. During that same session, Sophia admitted something new that made my stomach drop. She said she had actually stopped taking birth control 8 months ago, not 6 months like she told me before. She said she had been afraid to tell me the full truth because it made her actions seem worse. I felt whatever trust one had left completely crumble. I realized she had been lying in layers, only admitting pieces of the truth when she got cornered. Each new confession made me wonder what else she was still hiding. Elena asked her why she kept adjusting the timeline, and Sophia said she was ashamed. I pointed out that shame didn't excuse lying, and that every time she changed her story, it made everything worse. Sophia nodded and apologized again, but the apologies felt empty. Now I looked at Sophia and told her I needed to say something I had been thinking for days. I said that what bothered me the most wasn't just the lying or even the cheating, it was the sense of entitlement behind all of it. I explained that she decided she could make reproductive choices for both of us because she wanted a baby badly enough. I told her that stopping birth control without telling me was a violation of my consent, just like what my parents did to me was a violation. I said that her fear of losing me didn't justify taking away my right to make decisions about my own life and body. She started crying hard and saying she knew she had messed up. I stayed calm and kept my voice steady. I told her I understood she was scared, but that didn't make what she did okay. I said that if she had been honest with me about wanting children so desperately, we could have figured it out together. Instead, she chose to lie and manipulate, and now we were here. Elena nodded and said that was an important point about consent and partnership that we needed to sit with. Near the end of the session, I asked Sophia again about the coworker and how they met. She took a breath and started to explain. She said that during my convention trip, Laura had invited her to a work happy hour at a bar downtown. She said Laura introduced her to several people from her office, including someone named Alejandro Torres. She described it like it was just a casual night out with friends. She said they all hung out at the bar, and then people started leaving. The way she told the story sounded rehearsed and incomplete. I could hear the gaps where she was leaving things out. She kept using vague language, like hung out and talked and had drinks together. I didn't push for more details right then because I knew the paternity test would fill in what she wasn't saying. But hearing her try to make it sound innocent and accidental only made me more certain that she knew exactly what she had done. The session ended, and we scheduled the appointment at the clinic for the next morning. Sophia and I drove there in silence, the tension between us making even the radio feel too loud. At the clinic, we went through the intake process with a technician who checked our IDs and took photos for the chain of custody paperwork. The technician explained that Sophia would need to provide a blood sample for the non-invasive prenatal paternity test. She rolled up her sleeve and the technician drew several vials of blood while I sat in the corner chair watching. The technician labeled everything carefully and had us both sign forms confirming we witnessed the collection. Then she told us the results would take 7 to 10 business days to process. I felt my stomach drop at those words because it meant waiting another week or more in this horrible limbo. The technician handed us a pamphlet about the testing process and scheduled a follow-up appointment to review results. We walked out back to the car, and I realized my whole life was on hold, waiting for confirmation of what I already knew in my gut. The drive home was quiet again, and I dropped Sophia off before heading to my individual session with Elena that afternoon. I had been avoiding telling friends about any of this because I wasn't ready to go public yet. Sitting in Elena's office alone felt different from the couple sessions. She asked how I was really doing, and I admitted I felt humiliated and betrayed in ways I couldn't fully explain. She listened without judgment as I talked through everything from my parents forcing the vasectomy to Sophia's lies about birth control to this pregnancy that couldn't be mine. Elena helped me name the shame I had been carrying for years about my body and my fertility. She pointed out that both my parents and Sophia had violated my consent in different ways. Having a space where I could be completely honest without worrying about anyone else's feelings was a relief I didn't know I needed. When I got home that evening, my phone rang with my dad's number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. My dad's voice was stiff and formal, as he said they wanted to meet and talk like adults about this situation. I felt apprehensive immediately, because talking to my parents about anything real always ended badly. But I agreed to meet with them, adding that it needed to be on my terms, with clear boundaries about what we would discuss. My dad sounded surprised that I was setting conditions, but he agreed. We scheduled to meet at a coffee shop the following week. After hanging up, I felt anxious about seeing them. And what could they possibly say to defend themselves? In my next session with Elena, I told her about the upcoming meeting with my parents. She spent the hour coaching me on boundary statements and helping me practice what I needed to say. We went through different scenarios where they might get defensive or try to minimize what they had done. Elena had me practice saying out loud how their decision to force a vasectomy on me affected my entire adult life. She reminded me that I didn't owe them forgiveness or comfort, that this meeting was about me speaking my truth. We practiced me staying calm, even if they got upset or tried to make it about their feelings. By the end of the session, I felt more prepared, but still nervous. That same week, Sophia and I had another couple session where things finally broke open. I asked her directly about the timeline with the coworker again, keeping my voice steady. She looked down at her hands for a long time before finally admitting there was an encounter with Alejandro Torres, the coworker Laura had introduced her to at that happy hour. She said it was only one time, and she regretted it immediately afterward. Hearing her finally say it out loud made me feel physically sick, like I might throw up right there in Elena's office. But I also felt relieved in a strange way to finally have a concrete truth after weeks of her being vague and evasive. I asked if she had told Alejandro about the pregnancy yet. Sophia shook her head and admitted she hadn't contacted him. I felt anger rise in my chest and told her she was still avoiding responsibility. I said that Alejandro had a right to know he might be a father regardless of what happened with our marriage. Sophia started crying and said she was scared to tell him. I stayed firm and said that wasn't an excuse, that she needed to face what she had done. Elena supported this and said Sophia needed to inform Alejandro soon. 9 days after the blood draw, I got a call from the clinic saying my results were ready. I drove there immediately, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The receptionist handed me a sealed envelope, and I walked to my car in the parking lot. I sat there and opened it, reading the paternity test results that showed a 0% probability of me being the biological father. I read the report 3 times, looking at the numbers and the scientific language that confirmed what I had known all along. Even though I expected it, seeing it written in black and white made everything real in a way it hadn't been before. I sat in that parking lot for almost an hour, just holding the paper and trying to process that my marriage was truly over. When I got home that evening, I found Sophia in the living room. I told her I wanted a separation. She immediately started arguing, saying we could work through this and that counseling was helping. I stayed calm and firm, explaining that too much trust had been broken between us. I said I needed space to figure out what I wanted for my future. Sophia cried and begged me not to give up on us, but I didn't waver. I told her I had already contacted Pablo about the next steps. The next day, I met with Pablo at his office. He drew up a temporary separation agreement that outlined living arrangements and financial responsibilities. We went through every detail, like who would stay in the house and how we would split bills and what timeline we were looking at. Going through legal specifics felt numbingly practical, like I was organizing someone else's life instead of taking my own marriage apart. Pablo was professional and thorough, making sure I understood every clause before I signed anything. Then we discussed the birth certificate and parental rights. Pablo explained that since Sophia and I were married, I would automatically be listed as the father on the birth certificate unless we took legal steps to prevent it. He said I needed to be very clear about what I wanted. I told him directly that I wanted no legal or financial responsibility for a child that was not mine biologically. Pablo nodded and took notes about filing the necessary paperwork to protect me from being assigned paternity by default. He said we would need to involve Alejandro at some point to establish his rights and responsibilities as the biological father. The meeting lasted 2 hours and, by the end, I felt exhausted, but also relieved to have a legal path. Sure, go ahead. That same afternoon, I called Dr. Luis about my surgery. I explained everything that had happened with the paternity test and the separation. I told him I needed to postpone the reversal because my life was too unstable now to make decisions about future fertility. Dr. Luis listened silently and said he completely understood. He told me the option would be there when I was ready, which made me feel less like I was giving up on everything. Before we hung up, Dr. Luis started talking about other possibilities for the future. He explained that even with my vasectomy being so old, there were still options like sperm retrieval procedures and IVF, if I eventually wanted biological children. Hearing that there were still paths forward helped me separate hope for my future from the grief of my current situation. I thanked him and ended the call feeling like I had one less thing to worry about. The next day, I drove to my parents' house for the meeting we had scheduled. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel the whole way. When I walked in, they were sitting at the kitchen table, looking nervous. I sat down across from them and forced myself to start talking. I told them directly how their decision to force a vasectomy on me when I was 16 had damaged my entire life. My voice shook, but I kept going, explaining how it violated my bodily autonomy and took away choices that should have been mine to make. I demanded they acknowledge what they did instead of defending their intentions or making excuses. My dad looked down at the table, and my mom had tears in her eyes. They were both quiet for a long minute before my dad finally spoke. He admitted they made the decision out of fear after what happened with my brother. My mom added that they didn't consider how it would affect me long-term or how wrong it was to make that choice for me. They both agreed to seek therapy to understand why they thought they had the right to do that. I accepted their words with cautious hope, knowing it wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a start. When I got home, Sophia was waiting in the living room. I told her she needed to contact Alejandro about the pregnancy and his biological connection to the baby. She looked scared, but she nodded and said she would. I didn't trust her completely, so I called Pablo right there and asked him to document her commitment in case she backed out and I needed to inform Alejandro myself. Pablo made a note in his file and confirmed he had it on record. After that call, I went to my laptop and started removing myself from all the baby planning. I deleted the shared Amazon baby registry we had started. I left the group text with her family, where they had been discussing baby shower plans. I unsubscribed from all the parenting apps she had added me to without asking. Each deletion felt like letting go of a future I had wanted but was never going to have. It hurt, but it also felt necessary, as if I was finally accepting reality instead of holding on to false hope. A few days later, during one of our scheduled conversations at the house, Sophia told me she had started attending prenatal counseling sessions. She explained they were focused on single parenting preparation and accountability. I could see in her face that she was beginning to accept the reality that she would be raising this child without me. She looked sad, but also more grounded than she had been in weeks. We spent the next week working on logistics for me to move out. We sat at the dining room table with notebooks and divided up furniture piece by piece. We separated our bank accounts and credit cards. We set a timeline for when I would be completely moved out. I found an apartment on the other side of town that was available immediately and signed a lease the same day I saw it. Having my own space secured made the separation feel manageable instead of overwhelming. On Saturday, I drove to the thrift store with a bag of donations. At the bottom of the bag was the shirt Sophia had ordered me, the one that said, "World's Greatest Dad" on the front. I tossed it into the donation bin and watched it disappear with all the other discarded clothes. Letting it go felt sad, but also necessary, as if I was releasing the father role I had briefly imagined, along with all the false hope that came with it. That evening I sat at my computer and wrote a boundaries memo to my parents. I outlined clear conditions for continued contact going forward. They needed to attend therapy consistently and really work on understanding what they did. They needed to acknowledge the harm without getting defensive or making excuses. They needed to respect my decisions about my body and my life from now on. I read it 3 times to make sure I had said everything I needed to say. Then I attached it to an email and sent it. Watching it leave my outbox made me feel strong and clear, as if I was finally stating my needs instead of just accepting what they decided was best for me. 2 days later, Sophia knocked on my bedroom door and asked if we could talk. I followed her into the living room, where she sat on the edge of the couch looking nervous. She told me she had contacted Alejandro and explained everything about the pregnancy. He was shocked at first, but after thinking it over, he agreed to be involved as the biological father. She showed me text messages on her phone where he was asking about doctor's appointments and said he wanted to support the baby. I felt this strange combination of relief and grief wash over me. Relief because the baby would have a father who wanted to be there, but pain because it made everything feel so final. My marriage was really ending. There was no going back from this point. The next week we met with Pablo to file the legal separation papers. We sat across from each other at his conference table and went through each section together. We divided our shared bank account 50-50ths. We agreed that I would take my car and she would keep hers. We divided the list of furniture we had made earlier. The whole process felt businesslike, but also deeply sad, as if we were dismantling our life together, piece by piece, with check marks and signatures. When we got to the part about the baby, Pablo made it clear in the paperwork that I had no legal or financial responsibility, since I was not the biological father. Sophia affirmed without arguing. We both acknowledged out loud that we had hurt each other in ways that couldn't be fixed, that too much trust had been broken on both sides. Pablo witnessed our signatures and said he would file everything with the court by the end of the week. That Saturday I got in my car and just drove, with no destination in mind. I took back roads through neighborhoods I had never seen before, windows down, radio off, just thinking. After an hour, I pulled into a gas station lot and called Elena's office to schedule my next therapy appointment. The receptionist booked me for 2 weeks later. Then I opened my calendar on the phone and scrolled forward 6 months. I found an empty day and typed a note to call Dr. Luis about fertility options. The road ahead felt uncertain and somewhat scary, but I was building a life based on truth and clear boundaries now, and this felt like enough for now. That's the story and the little lesson within it. Hopefully, it gave you something to think about or maybe something to try. Either way, that's what makes sharing worthwhile. Subscribe and let's keep learning through these.